Rain hammered against the tall glass windows of St. Gabriel Medical Center as another hectic evening settled over the city. Nurses hurried through crowded hallways, doctors rushed from one emergency to another, and worried families filled waiting rooms with whispered prayers and anxious faces. Amid all the noise and urgency, one room at the very end of the oldest corridor remained almost forgotten. Inside room 417, an elderly man lay quietly in his hospital bed, wrapped in a plain blanket with no flowers beside him, no greeting cards on the table, no balloons tied to a chair, and not a single visitor waiting outside his door. The chair beside his bed had remained empty for days, perhaps even weeks. His clothes and worn belongings suggested a man who had lived a simple life with very little to call his own, and most of the staff had already decided he was just another lonely patient with nobody left to care. Every shift looked the same. Nurses entered just long enough to check his chart, adjust his medication, and leave without exchanging more than a few words. Some felt sorry for him, while others simply moved on to patients whose families demanded constant attention. Yet despite being treated almost like an invisible man, the elderly patient never complained. Instead, he quietly watched everyone who entered his room with calm, thoughtful eyes, as though he were carefully observing far more than anyone realized. That evening a newly assigned nurse named Emily Carter received room 417 as part of her rounds. It was only her third week at the hospital, and unlike many others, she hadn't yet learned to separate difficult patients from easy ones. To her, every person deserved the same kindness. As she stepped inside carrying a tray with warm soup, medicine, and fresh water, she greeted him with a gentle smile that immediately softened the silence in the room. "Good evening," she said warmly. The old man looked toward her and answered with a quiet smile of his own. "Good evening." Emily noticed almost instantly that the bowl of soup from earlier had gone completely cold and remained untouched. "Were you not hungry?" she asked with concern. "I was," he replied softly. She glanced toward the hallway. "No one helped you?" He simply smiled without bitterness. "Everyone is busy." Something about the way he said those words made Emily pause. There was no anger in his voice, only understanding. Without another word, she picked up the bowl, walked back to the nurse's station, reheated the soup herself, and returned a few minutes later. She carefully adjusted the pillows behind his back before sitting beside him. "If you don't mind," she said gently, "I'll help you eat." For several peaceful minutes she patiently fed him one spoonful at a time, never rushing, never looking at the clock hanging on the wall. Outside the room, two nurses happened to pass by. One looked inside and whispered, "She's still in there." The other sighed. "She'll stop doing that after a few months." "Why?" "Because you can't spend 20 minutes with one patient every shift." Their footsteps faded into the distance, but the old man had heard every word. Emily pretended she hadn't. After dinner she carefully tucked the blanket around his shoulders. "You'll sleep better now," she said with another gentle smile. The old man looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "You remind me of my wife. She always tucked my blanket exactly like that." Emily smiled. "She must have loved you very much." His eyes drifted toward the rain-covered window. "I've often wondered if I deserved someone like her." Before Emily could respond, movement outside the room caught her attention. A sharply dressed attorney carrying an expensive leather briefcase stopped briefly outside room 417. He looked through the doorway for only a moment. The elderly man met his eyes and gave the slightest shake of his head. Without saying a single word, the attorney nodded respectfully and quietly walked away. Emily frowned. "Was that someone you know?" "No," the old man answered almost too quickly. Before she could ask anything else, her pager vibrated, calling her to another patient. "I'll come back before my shift ends," she promised. "I'll be looking forward to that," he replied with a warm smile. After she left, silence returned to the room. The old man slowly reached toward the bedside table where only 3 personal belongings rested: a worn silver watch whose scratches spoke of countless years, a sealed leather notebook that never seemed to leave his side, and a pair of folded reading glasses. He picked up the old watch, gently rubbing its weathered surface with his thumb before looking toward the hallway where Emily had disappeared. A quiet smile crossed his face, not because his illness had improved, but because after countless days of being ignored by nearly everyone around him, one stranger had looked beyond his appearance and chosen to see the person he still was. And somewhere beyond that hospital corridor, hidden behind unanswered questions, mysterious visitors, and a notebook no one had yet opened, a secret waited patiently for the right moment to change everything. Emily kept her promise. Before every shift ended, no matter how exhausting the day had been, she always found herself walking back to room 417. At first it was simply to check whether the elderly man needed anything, but after a few days those visits became something she quietly looked forward to. Unlike many patients who filled the silence with complaints, he never asked for special treatment. He thanked her for every small gesture as though each act of kindness carried far more value than she could imagine. One evening she entered carrying a fresh bowl of chicken soup and a small paper bag. "Hospital dinner again?" he asked with a faint smile. Emily laughed softly. "Not tonight. I stopped by the cafe across the street. Their soup actually tastes like someone cooked it with love." He looked surprised. "You paid for this yourself?" She shrugged. "You shouldn't have to eat cold food every night." The old man's eyes lingered on her for a moment before quietly saying, "People don't usually spend their own money on strangers." Emily smiled while placing the bowl in front of him. "Maybe strangers are just friends we haven't known long enough." The old man chuckled, and it was the first genuine laugh anyone on the floor had heard from him. As the days passed, their conversations never centered on illness or medicine. Emily never asked whether he had children or how much money he had once earned. Instead she asked questions that seemed almost forgotten in today's busy world. "What's your favorite book?" she asked one afternoon while adjusting the curtains to let in a little sunlight. He thought for a moment. "The Count of Monte Cristo." "Not because of revenge, because it reminds us that patience can be stronger than anger." Another day she asked, "If you could visit one place again, where would you go?" He smiled at a memory only he could see. A tiny bookstore by the ocean. It smelled of coffee and old paper. "I haven't thought about that place in years." Slowly, almost without realizing it, he smiled more often. The lonely room that had once felt cold and forgotten began filling with quiet conversations about favorite authors, old songs, childhood adventures, and dreams that life had quietly tucked away. One afternoon Emily noticed the small radio sitting beside his bed had stopped working. "Do you listen to this often?" she asked. "Every evening," he answered. "It reminds me that the world is still moving outside these walls." She carried it home after her shift, asked her retired father to repair it, and returned the next morning with music once again filling the room. The old man's face lit up as soft jazz echoed through the speakers. "You fixed it." "Actually," she laughed, "my dad deserves the credit. I only delivered it." He gently rested his hand on the radio as if it were something priceless. Sometimes the smallest gifts make the loudest difference. Another evening, after her shift had officially ended, Emily remained in the room holding an old novel she had borrowed from the hospital library. "Would you like me to read?" she asked. He nodded. She spent nearly 40 minutes reading chapter after chapter while rain tapped against the windows outside. Neither of them noticed how late it had become until another nurse appeared at the doorway. "Emily," she whispered impatiently, "you're still here. Your shift ended almost an hour ago." Emily simply smiled. "I know." The nurse glanced toward the old man before quietly muttering, "You're wasting your kindness on someone nobody even remembers." The words were soft, but they landed heavily in the room. Before the old man could lower his eyes, Emily calmly stood up. "Kindness isn't something you waste," she replied. "Especially on someone who's alone." The hallway fell silent. The other nurse looked embarrassed before walking away without another word. The old man stared at the open book resting in Emily's hands. "You shouldn't argue with your coworkers because of me." Emily closed the novel with a gentle smile. I wasn't arguing because of you. I was reminding her what this job is supposed to mean. For the first time, emotion flickered across the old man's face. It disappeared almost instantly, but not before Emily noticed it. A few days later he surprised her with an unusual question while she helped him organize the books on his bedside table. Emily, do you believe honesty always rewards people? She looked at him curiously. Not always. Then why be honest? He watched her carefully as though her answer mattered more than either of them admitted. She thought quietly before answering. Because I have to live with myself longer than I live with anyone else's opinion. The old man slowly nodded but said nothing more. The question lingered between them long after the conversation ended. Outside room 417, however, something strange had begun happening. Every few hours the hospital administrator would receive confidential phone calls before quickly disappearing into his office. More than once Emily noticed senior management speaking in hushed voices whenever the old man's room number was mentioned. One afternoon she accidentally overheard the administrator say, "Tell them he's still stable, no, they don't need to come yet. I'll notify them if anything changes." The moment he noticed Emily nearby, the conversation ended abruptly. She frowned but continued walking, unsure why so much secrecy surrounded a patient everyone else seemed determined to ignore. Whatever truth hid behind room 417 was becoming harder to dismiss, and although Emily had no interest in gossip or secrets, she couldn't shake the feeling that the lonely man she had come to care about was carrying a story far greater than anyone inside that hospital could possibly imagine. The conversations between Emily and the elderly man slowly became the most peaceful part of their days. What had started as simple checkups had quietly transformed into something much deeper, though neither of them ever tried to define it. She no longer entered room 417 thinking only about medicine or vital signs. Instead, she found herself wondering what story he might share that day, while he seemed to wait for the sound of her footsteps with growing anticipation. One calm afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the window after several days of rain, Emily adjusted the curtains and asked, "Would you like me to bring another novel from the library?" The old man smiled thoughtfully but surprised her with a question instead. "Emily, what do you think makes someone truly successful?" She paused, almost expecting him to be joking. "That's a big question." "The important ones usually are," he replied gently. She leaned back in the chair beside his bed and thought for a long moment before answering. "I don't think success is measured by money or titles. I think it's measured by how many people sleep peacefully because you were part of their lives." The old man remained silent, studying her face carefully before giving a slow nod. "Interesting." A faint smile appeared, but it wasn't the smile of someone who had simply enjoyed an answer. It was the smile of someone quietly making a note of it. The next evening, after she finished checking his medication, he spoke again. "Can kindness survive if nobody ever notices it?" Emily looked at him with curiosity. "Of course. Even if there's no reward. Especially then." "Why?" She folded her arms and smiled. "Because kindness isn't a business transaction. If you're expecting something back every time you help someone, you're not really helping them. You're investing." The old man looked down at the worn silver watch resting beside his bed. "Not everyone believes that." Emily shrugged gently. "Maybe they forgot what kindness feels like." Another quiet nod. Another thoughtful silence. It was becoming clear that these conversations meant far more to him than ordinary small talk, yet she couldn't understand why. Days later, while replacing fresh flowers in another patient's room, she returned to find him gazing out the window. Without looking away, he asked, "If helping someone made your own life harder, would you still do it?" Emily laughed softly. "You're full of difficult questions this week." Humor an old man. She pulled the chair closer. "Yes, I would. Even if nobody thanked you." "Yes. Even if nobody remembered." She looked directly at him. "People aren't valuable because they remember us. They're valuable because they're people." The room fell quiet once again. The old man slowly closed his eyes for a brief moment, almost as though those words had reached a place inside him that had remained untouched for years. Emily noticed the emotion on his face but chose not to interrupt it. Instead, he surprised her by asking, "Tell me about yourself." She hesitated. "There's not much to tell. The people who say that usually have the most interesting stories." She smiled awkwardly before finally giving in. "I work here during the day, and 3 evenings every week I work at a small bookstore." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "2 jobs?" She nodded. "My younger brother just started engineering school. Our parents passed away years ago, so I promised him he'd never have to give up his education because of money." "That must be exhausting." "Sometimes. And yet you still spend extra time sitting in this room." She smiled. "Some things matter more than sleep." He remained quiet, waiting. She continued, "I also have student loans I'm still paying off, and sometimes I wonder if I'll ever stop worrying about bills." "Have you ever considered taking shortcuts?" he asked. Emily immediately shook her head. "No." "Why not?" "Because if I lose my integrity to solve today's problems, tomorrow's victories won't mean anything." Once again the old man offered only silence, but this time his eyes carried unmistakable admiration. Every answer she gave seemed to settle another invisible question inside his mind. Emily began wondering whether he had always been this philosophical or whether illness simply gave people more time to think. She never imagined these conversations were becoming something far greater than friendly discussions. Outside the room, however, strange events continued to unfold. Late one afternoon another sharply dressed visitor approached room 417. Unlike the attorney Emily had seen days earlier, this man carried no briefcase. He stopped just outside the doorway, looked toward the elderly patient, and seemed ready to enter. The old man's expression changed instantly. He gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. The visitor froze, lowered his eyes respectfully, and quietly turned away without speaking a single word. Emily watched the entire exchange from the nurse's station. It made no sense. Whoever these visitors were, they all behaved the same way. They arrived confidently, waited for the old man's silent approval, and disappeared the moment he refused them. When she returned to his room a few minutes later, she noticed something she had never seen before. Disappointment. It lingered briefly across his face before he forced another gentle smile. Emily almost asked who the visitor had been, but something told her he wasn't ready to answer. Instead, she simply picked up the book lying beside his bed and asked, "Shall I keep reading where we left off yesterday?" His expression softened immediately. "I'd like that very much." As Emily began reading, the questions hanging over room 417 only multiplied. Why did complete strangers treat this forgotten patient with such quiet respect? Why did hospital administrators become nervous whenever unfamiliar calls arrived? And why did every unusual conversation leave the old man looking less like a lonely patient, and more like someone carefully measuring the hearts of everyone around him? The peaceful rhythm that had settled over room 417 changed without warning the following week. Early one morning, Emily stepped off the elevator carrying fresh charts and a cup of coffee when she noticed something unusual near the nurse's station. 3 people dressed in tailored designer suits stood speaking quietly with the hospital administrator. Their expensive watches, polished shoes, and confident posture made them impossible to miss. Yet what caught Emily's attention wasn't their appearance, it was the urgency in their voices. As she walked past, one sentence drifted through the hallway. "Has there been any change in his condition?" Another voice quickly followed, "We need to know immediately." Before Emily could think much of it, the administrator noticed her nearby and politely ended the conversation. Curious, she continued toward room 417. When she opened the door, the elderly man was staring silently out the window. His expression, usually calm, carried an unusual heaviness. "Good morning," she said with her familiar smile. He returned it, but only faintly. "Good morning, Emily." She could tell something had happened. Are you feeling worse today? No, he answered softly. Just, expecting company. Less than an hour later, there was another knock at the door. The same elegantly dressed visitors entered without waiting for permission. A woman in her late 50s walked in first, followed by two well-dressed men who looked to be in their 40s. Their perfume filled the room before any warmth did. Emily stepped aside, assuming they were close family members finally arriving after weeks of absence. She smiled politely. I'm glad someone came to visit him. None of them answered. Instead, the oldest man looked directly at the doctor entering behind her. Doctor, has there been any improvement? The physician replied carefully, his condition remained stable. Has he completed any legal paperwork? The man asked almost immediately. Emily blinked in surprise. No one had asked whether the patient had slept well. No one had asked if he was in pain. No one had even greeted him. The elderly man lowered his eyes and remained completely silent. The woman finally looked toward the bed. Hello, uncle. Her voice sounded practiced, almost rehearsed. He nodded politely. It's been a long time. She forced a smile. We've all been very busy. He simply replied, I noticed. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. One of the younger men glanced toward the bedside table where the leather notebook rested before quickly looking away. Emily couldn't explain why, but every instinct told her something about these visitors felt wrong. Their expensive clothes suggested success, yet none of them carried the warmth normally seen in worried relatives. They stood near the bed as if attending a business meeting rather than visiting someone they supposedly cared about. After only a few minutes, they stepped outside with the doctor. Emily happened to be updating the patient's chart nearby when she overheard fragments of their conversation. Has he signed anything recently? One of the men asked quietly. The doctor answered firmly, I'm afraid I can't discuss confidential matters. We only want what's best for him, the woman insisted, though her voice carried little emotion. Emily watched them disappear down the hallway before returning to room 417. The old man hadn't moved. He was still staring through the window, though the peaceful expression she had grown accustomed to was gone. Would you like me to open the curtains a little more? She asked gently. He smiled without turning around. Thank you. She adjusted the curtains, allowing warm afternoon sunlight to fill the room. After a long silence, she finally asked, Are they your family? He took several seconds before answering. In a way. They seemed worried. He looked at her with tired eyes that revealed more than his words ever could. Sometimes people worry about losing things, more than losing people. Emily didn't fully understand what he meant, but she understood the sadness behind it. She decided not to ask another question. Instead, she poured him a glass of water and quietly changed the subject, telling him about a little boy she had treated earlier that morning who insisted every bandage should come with a superhero sticker. The old man laughed softly, grateful for the change in conversation. Later that afternoon, one of the younger relatives approached Emily alone near the nurse's station. He smiled politely, though something about the smile felt calculated. You're Nurse Carter? Yes. You've been taking care of my uncle. That's right. He glanced around to make sure no one else was listening. I was wondering, has he signed any documents recently? Maybe some papers brought by attorneys? Emily's expression immediately became professional. I'm sorry, but I can't discuss any patient's private information. His smile faded slightly. Of course. I understand. He slipped a business card from his wallet and quietly placed it on the counter. If you remember anything, anything at all, I'd appreciate a call. Emily didn't even look at the card before handing it back. I won't be doing that. The man stared at her for a second, surprised by the firmness in her voice, then forced another smile before walking away. As she watched him disappear down the corridor, an uneasy feeling settled deep inside her. Those visitors hadn't come searching for reconciliation. They hadn't come to hold an old man's hand or comfort him through illness. They had come searching for answers hidden inside paperwork no one else seemed allowed to see. Back inside room 417, the elderly man quietly closed his eyes as though he already knew exactly why they had returned after disappearing for so many years. Emily gently pulled the blanket over his shoulders once again, unaware that the growing tension surrounding this lonely patient had nothing to do with his health, and everything to do with a secret powerful enough to make people remember a man they had long ago chosen to forget. The following afternoon, the rain had finally disappeared, leaving warm sunlight to spill through the windows of room 417. Emily smiled as she entered carrying fresh linens and a small vase with 2 white daisies she had bought on her way to work. "I hope you don't mind," she said while placing them on the windowsill. This room needed a little color. The elderly man looked at the flowers for several seconds before smiling with genuine warmth. "They remind me of my wife's garden." Emily laughed softly. "Then I picked the right ones." He watched her begin her usual routine, changing the water pitcher, straightening the blanket, and carefully organizing the few belongings that rested on the bedside table. Unlike other patients whose tables overflowed with magazines, snacks, and family photographs, his possessions remained surprisingly few. The scratched silver watch, the folded reading glasses, the repaired radio that quietly played soft jazz, and the old leather notebook that never seemed to leave his side. As Emily reached across the table to dust beneath it, the notebook accidentally slipped from the edge and landed on the floor with a dull thud. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said immediately, bending down to pick it up. The leather strap had loosened from the fall, causing the notebook to open slightly in her hands. For the briefest moment, several neatly written pages became visible. She instinctively looked away before her eyes could read a single line. Without closing the notebook completely, she gently fastened the strap again and placed it back exactly where it had been. "I hope nothing was damaged," she said apologetically. The old man had watched the entire moment without saying a word. Instead of looking concerned, a quiet smile slowly appeared on his face. "Not at all," he answered calmly. Emily continued arranging the room as though nothing unusual had happened. She never asked what the notebook contained. She never apologized again or tried to explain herself. To her, someone else's private journal deserved the same respect as a closed bedroom door. The silence lingered for several minutes until she finished replacing the bed linens. "There," she said with satisfaction. "Much better." The old man looked toward the notebook resting peacefully beside the silver watch, then back at Emily. Most people would have looked. She stopped folding the blanket and smiled gently. "Maybe. You didn't. It wasn't mine to read." He studied her face carefully, almost searching for any sign that curiosity had tempted her. There was none. "Curiosity is a difficult thing to resist," he said quietly. Emily nodded. "It is. Then how did you resist it?" She thought for a moment before answering. "Because trust disappears much faster than curiosity." The old man lowered his eyes for a brief second, and although he said nothing immediately, something inside him seemed to settle peacefully. It was another answer to another question Emily never knew she had been asked. Later that evening, after she finished helping another patient down the hallway, she returned to room 417 carrying a fresh cup of tea. As she entered, she found the old man holding the notebook in both hands. "Emily," he said warmly, "would you do me a favor?" "Of course." He carefully handed her the notebook. "Would you place this back in the drawer beside my bed? My hands aren't steady today." She accepted it without hesitation. As she turned toward the bedside cabinet, the leather strap shifted once again, allowing one page to fall open for only a heartbeat. Emily instinctively caught the cover before it slipped any farther, immediately closing it without looking inside. She gently placed the notebook into the drawer and closed it. "Safe and sound," she said with a smile. "Thank you." The old man watched her closely. There was unmistakable gratitude in his eyes now, mixed with something deeper, respect. Emily had unknowingly passed another test without realizing there had ever been one. As she walked toward the sink to rinse his teacup, the notebook remained inside the drawer, its secrets untouched. Yet for the audience, fate allowed a fleeting glimpse before the cover closed. Across one open page appeared a carefully organized list of corporate names recognized around the world, companies whose logos could be found on skyscrapers, airplanes, technology, pharmaceuticals, and international banks. Beside each name were handwritten percentages, ownership structures, and annotations connected by neat lines that formed a web too complex to understand at a glance. It looked less like a personal diary and more like the private map of an empire. The glimpse lasted less than a second before the notebook disappeared into the drawer forever. Emily never noticed any of it. To her, it was simply an old notebook belonging to a lonely patient. But the audience now knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever secret surrounded the quiet man in room 417, it was far greater than anyone inside the hospital imagined. The mysterious visitors, the attorneys, the nervous administrators, the anxious relatives, and the strange philosophical questions were no longer isolated puzzles. Somewhere inside that worn leather notebook lay a truth powerful enough to connect every unanswered question. And for the first time, the old man no longer wondered whether he could trust Emily. The atmosphere inside St. Gabriel Medical Center changed almost overnight. No announcement was made, no explanation was offered, yet everyone could feel that something unusual was unfolding. It began with small details most people would have ignored. Two unfamiliar security guards appeared near the main entrance where there had always been only one. Reception staff suddenly started checking identification more carefully, and several sections of the hospital that had always been open to visitors quietly became restricted. Nurses whispered among themselves during coffee breaks, trying to guess what was happening. Some believed a famous politician had been admitted under a false name. Others thought an international celebrity was arriving for surgery. Emily listened to the rumors but paid little attention. Hospitals were full of stories that rarely turned out to be true. Her concern remained where it had always been, in room 417. When she walked in that morning, the elderly man was sitting beside the window, watching birds gather on a tree outside. The radio softly played an old jazz melody, and the vase of white daisies she had brought days earlier still brightened the room. "Looks like you've got visitors outside," Emily joked as she noticed several black luxury sedans parked near the hospital entrance. The old man glanced toward the parking lot for only a second before returning his eyes to the birds. "Perhaps they're visiting someone important," he replied calmly. Emily smiled. "That's what everyone keeps saying." "And what do you think?" he asked. She shrugged while checking his blood pressure. "I think people become very interested whenever someone powerful is involved." "Do they?" "Usually." He smiled faintly. "That's unfortunate." She looked at him curiously. "Why?" "Because importance is often confused with wealth." Before she could ask what he meant, someone knocked lightly before opening the door. It was the head nurse. "Emily, when you're finished here, the chief administrator wants to see all department staff in the conference room." Emily frowned. "Did something happen?" "No idea," the head nurse replied. "Just don't be late." As soon as she left, the old man quietly asked, "Do you enjoy working here?" Emily laughed. "Most days. Even when people make your job difficult." "Especially then," she answered with a smile. "The difficult days remind me why I became a nurse." The old man nodded with quiet satisfaction, saying nothing more. An hour later, nearly every department supervisor and senior physician gathered behind closed doors. Emily sat near the back of the conference room while the hospital administrator stood at the front looking more nervous than anyone had ever seen him. "Beginning today," he announced carefully, "certain patients will receive additional privacy measures. Some areas of the hospital may experience increased security, and if you notice unfamiliar visitors, please continue your duties as normal." A doctor raised his hand. "Can you tell us why?" The administrator hesitated before forcing a smile. "I'm afraid I can't discuss confidential matters." The room filled with confused glances. No one asked another question. As the meeting ended, Emily noticed two men in expensive suits speaking quietly with the administrator outside the conference room. Their conversation stopped the moment anyone approached. One of them handed over a sealed envelope before disappearing down the hallway. By afternoon, the hospital parking lot looked completely different. More luxury vehicles lined the entrance, their drivers remaining inside with engines running. Men and women dressed in tailored business suits entered the building carrying leather portfolios instead of flowers or gift bags. None of them stopped at the reception desk for directions. They all seemed to know exactly where they were going, yet strangely, most never reached room 417. Each time they approached the hallway, they were quietly intercepted by hospital leadership, exchanged a few whispered words, and left again. Emily couldn't make sense of any of it. During her lunch break, another nurse leaned closer and whispered, "Have you noticed all those expensive cars outside?" Emily nodded. "Everyone has. Someone told me a billionaire is here." Emily laughed. "In this hospital?" "That's the rumor." "Well, whoever it is, they're definitely not on my floor." She returned to room 417 expecting to find the old man asleep, but instead he was reading the same worn novel they had been sharing together. Nothing about him had changed. He still wore the same simple hospital gown. The silver watch still rested beside his bed. The repaired radio still played softly in the background. There was no sign that the growing tension throughout the hospital had anything to do with him. "Busy day?" he asked as Emily entered. "The strangest I've ever seen," she admitted. "Everyone's acting like royalty has arrived." He smiled almost imperceptibly. "Sometimes people become nervous before they know the whole story." Emily laughed while checking his chart. "Well, I hope whoever they're waiting for gets here soon. The suspense is driving everyone crazy." The old man looked at her with kind, thoughtful eyes but offered no explanation. Instead, he simply thanked her for bringing fresh tea and asked if she would read another chapter before the evening ended. Outside his room, tension continued to build with every passing hour. Security guards quietly changed positions, confidential meetings continued behind closed doors, unfamiliar executives arrived and disappeared without explanation, and the entire hospital seemed to be holding its breath for something no one could name. Yet inside room 417, the lonely patient remained exactly as he had always been, humble, patient, and quietly observant. It was that very simplicity that made the mystery even more impossible to ignore. Whatever secret surrounded the forgotten old man, it was no longer approaching. It was almost at the hospital's door. Emily expected another ordinary shift. Instead, it became the day that changed everything she believed she knew about the quiet man in room 417. The hospital felt strangely tense from the moment she arrived. Security officers stood at every major entrance, administrators hurried through the corridors with folders pressed tightly against their chests, and several elevators had been reserved exclusively for authorized personnel. No one explained why. Every question was answered with the same polite smile and the same frustrating sentence. Confidential hospital business. Emily simply shook her head and continued toward room 417 carrying breakfast and the latest novel she had borrowed from the library. When she entered, the old man greeted her with the same gentle smile that had become familiar over the past several weeks. Nothing about him reflected the unusual atmosphere outside. He thanked her for the tea, commented that the birds seemed especially cheerful that morning, and asked whether her younger brother had passed his engineering exam. Emily laughed. "He did. Barely, but he passed." "Then today is already a good day," the old man replied. She smiled while helping him adjust his blanket. Looking at him, she couldn't imagine why the entire hospital seemed to be preparing for something extraordinary. After making sure he was comfortable, she left to collect medication from the pharmacy. As she walked back through the executive wing, she noticed something that immediately caught her attention. Nearly 20 people dressed in expensive business suits stood outside one of the private conference rooms. Some spoke quietly into earpieces. Others carried leather briefcases stamped with the logos of international law firms. Several faces looked strangely familiar, though Emily couldn't remember where she had seen them before. She assumed they were corporate donors visiting the hospital's board of directors and continued walking. Just as she reached the hallway leading back to room 417, the hospital administrator suddenly rushed toward her. "Emily," he said, sounding unusually nervous, "room 417 needs fresh water immediately." "Of course." She hurried to the service station, filled a glass pitcher, and returned without another thought. As she approached the room, she noticed the door was slightly open. She intended only to knock and step inside, but the voices she heard made her stop. The room that had once been silent and lonely was now filled with people. Men and women in perfectly tailored suits stood respectfully around the bed. The same attorney who had quietly walked away weeks earlier now stood beside the window holding several sealed folders. Two elderly gentlemen Emily recognized from international business magazines stood near the foot of the bed. Another woman wearing an executive identification badge from a multinational corporation waited silently with a tablet in her hands. Nobody was sitting. Every person in the room remained standing with unmistakable respect. Then Emily heard the words that froze her in place. "Good morning, Chairman," one of the executives said quietly. "The board has assembled exactly as you requested." "Chairman." Emily felt her heartbeat quicken. Surely she had misunderstood. She remained motionless beside the half-open door, hidden from view. The old man she had helped eat soup, the man whose radio she had repaired, the lonely patient everyone ignored, slowly sat upright in bed. His posture changed almost imperceptibly. He did not become arrogant or intimidating. Instead, he simply carried himself with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to responsibility. "Thank you for coming," he said in the same gentle voice Emily knew so well. "Please begin." Another executive opened a thick folder. "The voting agreements have been reviewed. Through your holding companies, trusts, and foundation ownership, you continue to control the majority voting interest." Emily frowned, struggling to understand what she was hearing. The attorney continued calmly. "Without your signature, no succession plan can be finalized. The board unanimously agrees that the decision remains entirely yours." Another man spoke respectfully. "Chairman Harrison, several international shareholders have requested clarification regarding future leadership." Chairman Harrison simply nodded. "They'll receive an answer when I'm ready." No one argued. No one interrupted. The room fell completely silent, every executive waiting patiently for his next words. Emily's mind raced. Chairman Harrison. The name suddenly unlocked dozens of memories she hadn't realized she possessed. Newspaper headlines. Financial interviews playing silently on televisions inside airport lounges. Magazine covers featuring one of the world's most influential business leaders who had mysteriously disappeared from public life months earlier. The photographs had always shown him much younger, surrounded by skyscrapers, world leaders, and corporate logos. She had never connected those images with the quiet elderly patient who thanked her for bringing tea every morning. Suddenly every unanswered question crashed together inside her mind. The mysterious attorney who kept visiting without entering the room. The confidential phone calls that terrified hospital administrators. The expensive relatives who cared more about paperwork than recovery. The leather notebook she had refused to read. The names of global corporations she had accidentally glimpsed for only a heartbeat. The endless stream of executives waiting outside his door. Even the scratched silver watch suddenly made sense. It had never been valuable because of its price. It had been valuable because it belonged to the man who had built one of the largest business empires in the world. Every clue that had seemed disconnected now fit together perfectly. Emily remained frozen outside the doorway, barely remembering to breathe. One executive carefully placed another folder on the bedside table. "Chairman, your family has again requested a private meeting regarding succession." Harrison looked toward the window before quietly answering, "They've had years to become a family." They don't get to become one because a signature is valuable. No one responded. The attorney simply closed the folder. Another board member spoke carefully. The market continues speculating about your successor. Harrison smiled faintly. Markets can afford to be patient. The room remained silent once again. Then, as though sensing someone nearby, Chairman Harrison slowly turned his head toward the doorway. His eyes met Emily's. For a long moment neither of them spoke. There was no anger in his expression. No disappointment. Only quiet understanding. Emily immediately lowered her eyes, embarrassed that she had accidentally witnessed something so private. She whispered, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. Harrison looked toward the executives before speaking calmly. It's all right. Then, with the same kindness he had always shown her, he added, Please come in, Emily. Her hands trembled slightly as she stepped into the room holding nothing more than a simple pitcher of water. Yet somehow it felt as though she had just walked into the center of a world she never knew existed. The lonely patient everyone had ignored was not merely a wealthy man. He was the man powerful enough to influence the future of one of the largest corporate empires on Earth. And despite possessing unimaginable influence, he had spent weeks asking only one question that truly mattered, not who deserved his fortune, but who deserved his trust. Emily stood quietly near the doorway, still holding the glass pitcher in trembling hands. The room that had once belonged to a forgotten patient now felt like the center of an invisible world. International executives remained standing with respectful silence while the elderly man looked toward them before speaking in the same calm voice she had come to know so well. Please give us a few minutes. Without hesitation, every attorney, board member, and executive nodded respectfully. One by one, they gathered their folders and quietly left the room. Within seconds, the crowd disappeared, the door closed softly behind them, and room 417 became peaceful once again. Only Emily and Chairman Harrison remained. For several long moments, neither of them spoke. Emily finally broke the silence. I don't even know what to say. Harrison smiled gently. Then don't say anything yet. She slowly set the pitcher on the bedside table and pulled the chair closer, almost afraid she might somehow offend him simply by sitting down. The thought made Harrison chuckle. You know, he said warmly, you're the first person in weeks who still looks at me like an ordinary human being. Emily looked down with an embarrassed smile. I'm trying to understand how everything I thought I knew became something completely different in less than a minute. Did it? He asked softly. She looked back at him. You aren't who I believed you were. Harrison slowly shook his head. Actually, Emily. I'm exactly the same man you met on your first day. The only thing that changed is what you learned about me. Those words settled quietly between them. Emily realized he was right. The man who thanked her for soup, laughed during old novels, asked impossible questions, and listened more than he spoke had not changed at all. Only the title attached to his name had. Harrison looked out the window for a moment before continuing. Do you know why I came here under another name? Emily gently shook her head. He took a slow breath. Because I spent 40 years building companies, and the last 20 trying to discover whether anyone still saw me instead of my money. His voice remained steady, but beneath the calm rested years of quiet disappointment. The first billion changed everything. Not my lifestyle. Not my goals. My relationships. Emily listened without interrupting. Harrison continued. Old friends suddenly remembered my birthday. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in decades began inviting me to family dinners. Business partners smiled while secretly calculating what they could gain. Even simple conversations stopped being simple. He looked toward the repaired radio sitting beside the window. People no longer asked how I was feeling. They asked what I was planning to buy next. They stopped seeing a man and started seeing an opportunity. Emily felt her chest tighten. Harrison smiled sadly. Do you know what loneliness looks like when you're wealthy? She remained silent. It's sitting at a table with 20 people while wondering whether a single one of them would still be there if tomorrow morning every dollar disappeared. The room became completely still. Harrison slowly reached for the worn silver watch resting beside him. This watch belonged to my father. He worked as a mechanic his entire life. He owned almost nothing, yet everyone who knew him loved him. When I became successful, I thought money would give me more freedom. Instead, it slowly stole certainty. I could never again tell whether someone was shaking my hand because they respected me, or because they respected what I owned. Emily quietly whispered, "I'm sorry." Harrison smiled kindly. "Don't be. Life simply taught me a lesson I wasn't expecting." He paused before looking directly into her eyes. "Several months ago, after my diagnosis, I realized I had one final opportunity. One last chance to answer a question that had haunted me for years." "What question?" Emily asked softly. Harrison leaned back against his pillow. "Does genuine kindness still exist when there is absolutely nothing to gain?" Emily lowered her eyes, remembering every bowl of soup, every chapter she had read after work, every extra hour she had stayed without expecting thanks. Harrison continued, "So I asked my attorneys to admit me under a different identity. No private hospital. No executive suite. No special treatment. Just an ordinary room where no one knew my name." A faint smile crossed his face. The results were painful. Emily already knew what he meant. "Most people saw an old man with no visitors," Harrison said quietly. "Some saw extra work. Others saw someone who would probably never complain. A few barely saw me at all." His voice softened. "Then you walked into my room." Emily felt tears beginning to gather in her eyes. Harrison smiled warmly. "You never once asked how much money I had. You never searched the notebook. You refused information someone tried to buy from you. You defended me when others mocked me. You repaired an old radio because you believed one lonely man's evenings mattered." He chuckled gently. "You even bought me soup because you thought hospital food tasted terrible." Emily laughed through her tears. "It really did." Harrison laughed with her before becoming serious once more. "Every question I asked you, about honesty, kindness, success, they were never random conversations." Emily finally understood. "They were tests." Harrison slowly nodded. "Not because I wanted perfect answers. I wanted truthful ones." He looked at her with unmistakable gratitude. "Every single answer you gave matched every action you took. That's rarer than you probably realize." Emily wiped a tear from her cheek. "I only treated you the way I hope someone would treat my father." Harrison's eyes glistened for the first time. "Exactly." He looked toward the window where the afternoon sunlight filled the room with quiet warmth. "For the first time in many years, I stopped wondering whether goodness still existed. You answered that question without ever knowing you were being asked." Emily sat speechless, realizing that everything she had done so naturally had become something far more valuable than she could have imagined. She had not impressed the chairman because of extraordinary talent or remarkable intelligence. She had simply reminded one deeply lonely man that genuine compassion still lived in a world that had almost convinced him otherwise. Harrison smiled peacefully, his expression lighter than it had been since the day she first met him. "Money can build companies," he said softly, "but it can never buy the kindness you gave freely." Emily looked at him with quiet emotion, never imagining that the greatest gift she had offered him had cost her almost nothing at all. Yet somewhere beyond that room, executives, attorneys, and impatient relatives still waited for the chairman's next decision, completely unaware that the choice he was about to make had already begun long before they arrived. The following morning, the atmosphere surrounding room 417 remained unusually quiet. The executives had returned to their meetings, the attorneys continued reviewing documents behind closed doors, and the impatient relatives waited in private lounges, hoping for news that would favor them. Emily, however, tried her best to return to normal. She entered the room carrying breakfast just as she always had. She adjusted the curtains, checked Chairman Harrison's medication, and asked whether he had slept well. Nothing about her behavior changed now that she knew who he really was. Harrison noticed it immediately. As she finished recording his vital signs, he smiled. "You're still treating me exactly the same." Emily looked up with a gentle laugh. "Should I be doing something different?" "Most people would." She shook her head. "You're still my patient." Harrison leaned back against his pillow with quiet satisfaction. "Thank you for proving me right once again." Emily looked at him curiously. "About what?" "About character." He reached toward the bedside drawer and removed a slim blue folder before placing it on the blanket. "Would you mind sitting for a moment?" She pulled the chair closer. "Of course." Harrison rested his hand on the folder but did not open it immediately. "Yesterday you learned something about my life that very few people ever truly understand. They see the companies, the boardrooms, the headlines, and the wealth. What they rarely see is responsibility." Emily listened quietly. "Every decision I've ever made affected thousands of employees, their families, and communities around the world. That taught me something very important." He looked directly at her. "Leadership isn't measured by how many people obey you. It's measured by how many lives become better because you were there." Emily nodded thoughtfully. Harrison slowly opened the folder. Inside were several neatly prepared documents bearing official seals and signatures. "Before I came here, I instructed my legal team to prepare something. I wasn't certain who would eventually receive it." Emily frowned slightly. "Receive what?" Harrison smiled. "An opportunity." He gently turned the first page toward her. Across the top she read the words, "The Emily Carter Foundation for Compassionate Patient Care." She blinked, convinced she had misunderstood. "Chairman, this can't be." Harrison nodded. "It already is." Emily stared silently at the documents while he continued speaking. "The foundation will finance free medical treatment for patients who cannot afford proper care. It will provide scholarships for nursing students who choose compassion over convenience. It will fund programs that ensure no elderly patient spends their final days alone simply because they have no family beside them." Emily slowly looked back at him, her eyes already filling with tears. "You named it after me?" Harrison smiled warmly. "Because you reminded me why it should exist." She immediately shook her head. "No, there are people far more qualified than I am. Hospital directors, experienced administrators." Harrison gently interrupted her. "Qualified to manage budgets, perhaps." He leaned forward slightly. "But compassion cannot be taught inside a boardroom." Emily lowered her eyes. "I've never led an organization." "You already have," Harrison replied softly. She looked confused. He continued, "Every time you walked into this room, you made a choice. You chose patience when others chose convenience. You chose dignity when others chose indifference. You chose honesty when no one was watching. That's leadership in its purest form." Emily struggled to find words. "I'm just a nurse." Harrison smiled. "Exactly." He pointed toward the foundation documents. "I don't need another executive. The world already has plenty of those. It needs someone who remembers that healing begins long before medicine does." Tears quietly rolled down Emily's cheeks. "I don't know if I can do something this important." Harrison looked at her with complete confidence. "Neither did I when I built my first company." He chuckled softly. "The difference between ordinary people and extraordinary leaders is rarely talent. It's the willingness to care when caring becomes difficult." Emily carefully closed the folder, still overwhelmed by everything she had heard. "I never helped you because I expected something in return." Harrison nodded. "That's precisely why you deserve the opportunity." He paused before adding one final thought. I'm not rewarding your kindness with money. Money disappears. I'm trusting your character with responsibility. That lasts much longer. Emily held the folder close to her chest, realizing this gift was far greater than any inheritance could ever be. It wasn't about becoming wealthy. It was about being trusted to change countless lives with the same compassion she had shown one forgotten patient. For the first time since entering room 417 weeks earlier, she fully understood that genuine kindness always leaves an inheritance. Sometimes it isn't written in bank accounts or corporate shares. Sometimes it's written in the lives that become brighter because one person chose to care. Several weeks passed, and autumn slowly gave way to the first signs of winter. The Emily Carter Foundation had already begun laying the groundwork for free treatment programs, nursing scholarships, and patient care initiatives across the city. Yet despite all the planning and meetings, Emily found herself spending every spare moment in room 417. Chairman Harrison's health had gradually declined, but his spirit never seemed to weaken. Even on difficult days, he greeted every nurse, doctor, and cleaner with the same quiet smile that had first puzzled her weeks before. One peaceful evening, as soft rain tapped gently against the hospital windows, Emily sat beside his bed reading aloud from one of his favorite novels. Harrison listened with his eyes closed, occasionally smiling at familiar passages. When she finished the chapter, silence filled the room. He slowly opened his eyes and looked toward the window. "You know," he whispered, "people spend their whole lives trying to become unforgettable." Emily squeezed his hand gently. "You already are." He smiled faintly before shaking his head. "Not because of the companies. Not because of the money." He looked at her with calm acceptance. "If anyone remembers me, I hope it's because I reminded them to see people before possessions." Emily struggled to hold back tears. Harrison reached toward the bedside table and handed her 3 sealed envelopes. "One is for you. One is for the board. And one is for my family." She carefully accepted them. "Promise me something. Anything. Never let kindness become a transaction." Emily nodded immediately. "I promise." Harrison's breathing became slower, but his expression remained peaceful. "Then I can finally rest." Those were the last words he ever spoke. Early the next morning, Chairman Harrison quietly passed away in the same simple hospital room where everyone had once believed he was just another forgotten old man. News of his passing spread across the world within hours. Business networks interrupted their broadcasts. World leaders released statements. Newspapers called him one of the greatest business visionaries of his generation. Yet none of those headlines mentioned the small hospital room where he had spent his final weeks searching for something money could never buy. At his memorial service, Harrison's final letters were read aloud. His message to the board reminded them that profit without compassion eventually destroys itself. His message to his relatives spoke not of disappointment but of forgiveness, urging them to value one another before it became too late. Emily opened her own letter only after returning home that evening. Inside, written in Harrison's steady handwriting, were just a few simple lines. "Dear Emily, thank you for treating an ordinary man with extraordinary dignity. Never doubt that quiet acts of kindness can change histories you'll never live long enough to see. Continue seeing the invisible, because the world never runs out of people waiting to be noticed. With gratitude, Harrison." Emily folded the letter carefully, knowing she would treasure it forever. A few days later, she found herself standing once again outside room 417. The room had been cleaned, the flowers removed, and every trace of Harrison's stay had disappeared. The bed stood empty, bathed in the gentle light of the afternoon sun. She stepped inside, smiled softly, and whispered, "Thank you." For a moment, the silence felt almost comforting. Then her pager buzzed. A new patient had just been admitted to the neighboring room. According to the chart, he was an elderly widower with no emergency contacts and no expected visitors. Several nurses sighed as they walked past his door, already assuming he would be another lonely patient. Emily quietly picked up a fresh blanket, prepared a warm cup of soup, and walked toward his room with the same gentle smile she had offered Harrison on the very first day they met. She knocked softly before entering. "Good afternoon," she said warmly. "My name is Emily, and I'll be taking care of you." The old man looked up with surprised eyes, and for the first time that day, he smiled. In that simple moment, room 417 was no longer empty. Harrison's greatest legacy had never been his fortune, his companies, or his influence. It was the compassion he had awakened in someone who had already possessed it all along. And somewhere beyond titles, wealth, and success, one quiet act of kindness continued changing lives, one forgotten patient at a time.